All right, get ready, because today we're going deep, really deep into a world of, well, I guess you could say hidden empires.
Empires built on, well, a lot of controversy.
That's one way to put it. We're talking about the Assad family fortune.
And it's really a staggering amount of money,
Tens of billions, in fact.
making them one of the richest families in the whole Middle East and,
It's a story that goes way beyond just your typical rags to riches.
way beyond. What's really striking is how all this wealth, unimaginable wealth.
Was built up in a country, Syria, where so many people are struggling.
Exactly, amidst devastating poverty. It really makes you question the regime's priorities.
Doesn't it? We've all heard about Assad, the dictator.
Right.
But this deep dive, well, we're going further.
They're going beyond the headlines, that's for sure.
We're digging into these sources, trying to understand how this fortune was built.
Where it is, all that money.
And the controversies. Oh, the controversies that surround it all.
And there are plenty of those.
You're talking $40 million apartments in Moscow.
And while Syria's in the middle of a civil war,
Designer shopping sprees. It's a lot to unpack.
it is a lot.
So let's go back to the beginning.
Okay.
How this all started. The Assad family, their rise to power, that's a whole story on its own.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating story, too.
And Bashar al-Assad, the current president,
Right.
he wasn't always on this path.
No, not at all. Believe it or not, he was actually trained as, get this, an ophthalmologist.
An eye doctor.
An eye doctor. It's kind of hard to imagine now.
It really is.
But his father, Hafez al-Assad, that's where it all began.
Ruled Syria for almost 30 years.
And, in a way, he laid out the blueprint for this whole dynasty.
How so?
He was brilliant, in a terrible sort of way, but he knew how to connect political power with economic control.
So it wasn't just about ruling the country.
No. It was about controlling its wealth.
The resources, the people.
Everything. And Bashar, well, you could say he inherited this system.
And took it even further.
I'd say so.
But this line of succession, how it all happened,
Yeah.
it's almost like something out of, a movie.
Tell me about it.
Bashar's older brother, Basil, he was the one they were grooming.
For leadership, yeah.
But then tragedy struck.
Car accident.
And suddenly, Bashar was thrust into this position of, immense power.
It's hard to fathom the kind of pressure that puts on a person.
I can't even imagine. So when Bashar took over, this was back in 2000.
Right around then, yeah.
There was, a sense that maybe things would be different.
A glimmer of hope, you could say.
You might be a reformer.
People were talking about modernization, real change.
But what happened?
I think what we saw was, in a lot of ways, a continuation of his father's policies.
Really?
Even more than a continuation, in some ways, an amplification.
The repression got worse.
Sadly, yes.
Yeah.
And the exploitation of the Syrian people.
Which, of course, meant more wealth for the Assads and their, inner circle. So this massive fortune, how did they actually build it?
It's not just one thing. It was a combination.
What do you mean?
Corruption, for starters.
Right.
Then you have crony capitalism.
Like, what does that even mean?
It's a system where being loyal to the regime gets you rewarded.
Rewarded how?
Control over entire industries.
Whoa.
We're talking oil,
Wow.
telecommunications, real estate, banking, you name it.
So basically anything that a country needs to function.
Basically, the Assads and their allies, they were getting these incredibly lucrative contracts.
I see.
They manipulated markets, they were extorting businesses, all to get ahead.
So they weren't just taking a cut, they were basically taking the whole pie.
Pretty much.
I read somewhere that they were siphoning off something like 60 to 75% of Syria's entire economic output.
Yeah, the numbers are pretty staggering.
And then they funnel all this money, all this wealth
Through offshore accounts.
shell companies. It's like a financial shell game.
On a global scale, too.
Exactly. And these offshore accounts, the shell companies, that's how they were able to hide everything.
Oh, absolutely. Think of them like secret boxes.
Hidden.
Hidden away in countries where the financial laws aren't so strict. They obscure who the real owner is.
So it makes it almost impossible to trace the money.
Right, to figure out where it came from, where it's going.
Wow.
Yeah. And then there's Rami Malek. Can't talk about the Assad family fortune without talking about him.
Who is he?
Bashar's cousin. Basically their business czar, you could say.
And how much was he worth?
Oh, estimates put his personal net worth somewhere between $5 and $10 billion.
That's insane.
It is, right. Gives you a sense of just how big this whole financial network really is.
So how did this guy, Rami Malek, how did he fit into this whole system?
He was involved in almost every major industry in Syria. telecom, construction, oil. He even had duty-free shops,
Really?
even the national airlines.
So he had his fingers in a lot of pies.
That's an understatement.
Yeah.
And with that kind of control, he could manipulate entire sectors of the economy.
For his own gain, I imagine.
Of course. And by extension, for the Assad family's gain, they were squeezing out competition, maximizing profits, the whole 9 yards.
I guess that's crony capitalism in action.
Textbook example. And the consequences, for the Syrian people, they were dire.
In what way?
Resources were diverted. Things like essential services, public investment, all the things that could have helped people.
Lifted them out of poverty.
Exactly. But instead, it all went to enriching this select few.
It's a pretty grim picture.
It is. It really is.
So we've established that the Assad family, well, they've got a lot of money.
A mind-boggling amount.
But how are they hiding it all?
That's where we get into the world of hidden assets.
Financial secrecy, all that.
Right. It's estimated that their total fortune, are you ready for this?
Hit me.
It's somewhere between $60 and $120 billion.
No way!
It's almost impossible to get an exact figure because of all the shell companies, the offshore accounts.
It's this whole web of secrecy.
A deliberate strategy to, well, obfuscate, to protect their wealth. It's a complicated network spread all over the world.
Sounds like something out of a spy movie.
You know, it kind of is. Except the consequences are, well, very real, especially for the people of Syria.
That's a good point.
But even though it's hard to track, we do have some insights into their assets. Some pretty striking ones, actually.
Like what?
Well, they're the luxury real estate holdings.
Oh, right. I remember reading about those.
Multi-million-dollar properties in places like London, Moscow, Dubai, prime locations.
I think I remember reading about some apartments in Moscow, too.
Oh, yeah. Those were something else. $40 million apartments uncovered in an investigation.
Wow.
The scale of it in a country that's supposed to be an ally to the Syrian people, it's pretty telling.
It really makes you think about their priorities.
Exactly. But real estate, it's just the tip of the iceberg, really.
What else is there?
There's the art, the jewelry, the gold, lots and lots of gold.
How much gold are we talking about?
One report suggested they were holding something like 200 tons.
Seriously?
Gold, art, jewels. It's a classic way to preserve wealth, especially during times of, crisis or political instability.
Makes sense, I guess. But wait, what about the cars? I heard they have quite the collection.
Oh, yeah. We're not talking about your average family car here.
No.
They've got a Ferrari F50.
No.
A Lamborghini Diablo. Multiple Rolls-Royce Phantoms.
This is while people in Syria are struggling to survive. It's hard to comprehend.
It really is. It's a blatant display of wealth and power.
So we've got the real estate, the gold, the cars. What else is part of this financial empire?
Well, there's also the private banking networks.
Ah, yes. Essential for moving money around, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Avoiding scrutiny, evading sanctions. Their networks span Switzerland, Lebanon, Russia.
A global operation.
It's how they move vast sums of money, shield their assets.
Like a whole financial spider web.
You could say that. Woven to protect their wealth and make sure it keeps growing.
It's incredible, really.
It is.
So we've talked about how much money they have, where it comes from, how they hide it. But what about, the controversies?
This is where it gets, well, particularly dark. We're not just talking about wealth gained through questionable means.
No.
We're talking about wealth built during a horrific civil war.
While millions of Syrians were suffering.
Exactly. And that contrast, it's pretty disturbing.
It really is.
Yeah.
Their lifestyle, all the opulence, juxtaposed against all that suffering.
It's almost incomprehensible.
It's almost too much to think about.
It is. And perhaps the most striking example of this, well, is al-Assad, Bashar's wife.
Oh, yeah. What about her?
While millions of Syrians were facing, starvation, displacement, the horrors of war.
She was living a life of luxury.
She was spending outrageous amounts of money on designer goods, handbags, clothing, all of it.
And this was all while there were international sanctions on the regime.
The timing of it is, well, it's just remarkable.
It really is. Like, she was living in a completely different world.
A world completely detached from the reality of what was happening in Syria.
It's hard to believe.
It is. And speaking of things that are hard to believe, we can't forget about the Panama Papers.
Oh, right. That whole scandal exposed a lot, didn't it?
It really did. Exposed how the global financial system works, how the wealthy and powerful can use it for their own benefit.
And the Assad family was right in the middle of it.
They were. The Panama Papers revealed how they were using offshore companies these secretive financial structures to move money around.
And to avoid those sanctions we were just talking about.
Exactly. The very measures that were supposed to hold them accountable.
It's like this whole elaborate game they were playing.
It is a game with very real consequences.
So where do we go from here? It's a lot to take in.
It is. It really is. And it leaves us with more questions than answers.
Like, can justice ever truly be served? Can the victims, the Syrian people, can they ever see accountability for what happened?
And with all this wealth, so well hidden, can it ever be recovered? Can those stolen assets be used to help rebuild lives?
Those are the questions we have to ask ourselves.
If we want to see a just resolution to all of this,
It's a long road ahead.
a long road.
But we've only just begun to scratch the surface here.
There's so much more to uncover.
And there are cracks appearing. Recent reports suggest that the Assad family, they might be on the move,
Fleeing Damascus.
seeking refuge, maybe in Russia.
And if they are, well, that could change everything.
What do you mean?
We'll have to dive into that in the next part of our deep dive.
I can't wait. So we just talked about how much money the Assads have, how they got it, and how they're hiding it. It's a lot to wrap your head around, but now let's talk about what's being done to hold them accountable.
And potentially even recover some of that, well, stolen wealth.
It sounds almost impossible, you know? Where do you even begin with something this complicated?
Well, it's definitely a challenge, a huge one, to be honest.
Right.
But there are people, organizations out there working hard to expose their financial networks,
Really?
trying to find legal ways to recover those assets. It's not easy, and it takes a long time.
So what are they doing? How do you even find money that's hidden in all these, what were they called, shell companies and offshore accounts?
It's like looking for a needle in a haystack, you're right.
It is.
But one of the key strategies is asset tracing and recovery. It involves basically following the money.
Okay, so following the money, but how?
You identify assets held by, well, the Assad family, their cronies, and then try to freeze those assets. The ultimate goal is to seize them legally.
So it's kind of like detective work, but on a global scale?
You got it. You're untangling this web of, well, everything we talked about. Shell companies, offshore accounts, hidden investments.
It sounds so complicated.
It is. You need sophisticated techniques, cooperation between different countries, and a really deep understanding of financial loss.
It must take forever.
It often does. There are a lot of legal hurdles and challenges. But if we want to see justice, and if we want to see those stolen assets returned to the Syrian people, this is what it takes.
So what are the biggest challenges? I mean, I can't even imagine.
One of the biggest is just how complex these financial structures are. We're talking about layers upon layers of shell companies, trusts, nominee accounts, all designed to hide the true owners.
I've heard about those nominee accounts, but I don't really get how they work. Can you explain?
Sure. Imagine someone from the Assad family wants to buy, let's say, a luxury apartment in London.
Okay.
But they don't want their name to be on the deed.
Right.
They would use a nominee, someone they trust, or even a shell company to hold that property for them.
Oh, so it looks like someone else owns the apartment?
Exactly. But behind the scenes, the Assad family controls it.
Wow, sneaky.
It is. It is. It's a way to hide in plain sight, basically.
And this isn't just happening in one country.
Nope. Their assets are often in multiple countries, and each country has its own legal system, its own level of cooperation, too.
That sounds like a nightmare.
It can be. And then, of course, there's the issue of political will.
Yeah.
To actually hold powerful people accountable, it takes courage. It takes commitment.
And sometimes those things are in short supply.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
So even if you have the evidence, even if everyone agrees that justice needs to be served, it can still get bogged down in all the...
Politics and bureaucracy.
Exactly.
But surely there are some success stories, right? I mean, haven't there been cases where they've actually recovered assets and held people accountable?
There have been. Not all of them are successful, but there are some notable ones. And it's important to remember, these cases, they can take years, sometimes decades.
Really?
Oh, yeah. One example, I think we mentioned it briefly before, is the recovery of assets stolen by Sani Abacha.
That was the Nigerian dictator, right?
That's right. He died back in 1998. But his family, his associates, they siphoned off billions from Nigeria's public funds.
Billions, wow. And they got it all back.
Not all of it, but a significant portion. It was stashed in offshore accounts, investments, all over the place. But through a lot of effort, Nigerian authorities, with help from international partners,
They tracked it all down.
they were able to trace it, freeze the assets, and then build a legal case to get them back.
That's amazing. Billions of dollars hidden across the world, and they found it.
It was a huge undertaking. A lot of detective work, a lot of collaboration, but it shows that it can be done.
So what were the keys to their success? I mean, I'm sure there are lessons to be learned here, right?
Well, absolutely. First and foremost, the Nigerian government, they were committed. They wanted to hold those responsible accountable. They wanted to recover those funds for the people.
So having a government that's actually committed to this is important.
It's crucial. Without that, these cases can just, I don't know, stall out, get lost in all the red tape.
Makes sense.
And then, of course, international support was also key. Countries like Switzerland, the UK, the US, they played a big role. They helped freeze assets, provided evidence, facilitated legal proceedings.
So when countries work together, it's more likely to be successful.
Exactly. It highlights how important it is to have strong relationships between countries and strong legal frameworks that allow for cooperation.
Like a global effort to combat corruption.
Exactly. The Abacha case, it's a great example of what can be achieved when everyone works together.
So what are the takeaways here? What can we learn from the Abacha case and apply to the Assad situation?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is persistence, never giving up. These cases, they can take a long time.
Years, we said.
Years, decades even. And there will be setbacks, legal challenges, political roadblocks. But you can't give up. You have to stay focused on the goal.
Keep pushing.
Exactly. And it's not just about one strategy. You need a multifaceted approach. Combine legal strategies, investigative techniques, international cooperation.
Don't put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak.
Right. Each case is different. You have to be adaptable, creative, resourceful.
And build those relationships, those partnerships.
Absolutely. The Abacha case, it's a great example of what can happen when you have a global network of people, institutions, all committed to fighting corruption.
It sounds inspiring, honestly, but it also sounds incredibly difficult.
Oh, it is. It really is.
And have there been cases where, despite everyone's best efforts, it just hasn't worked, where they couldn't recover the assets?
Yes, unfortunately.
Yeah.
It doesn't always work out the way we hope. One example, I think we touched on it before, is the case of Zine El Abidine Ben Ali.
He was the president of Tunisia, right?
It's right. He and his family, they amassed a lot of wealth through corruption. And when they were ousted during the Arab Spring.
Oh, right. The Arab Spring. A lot of people might not remember that.
It was a series of pro-democracy protests and uprisings that started back in 2010, spread across the Middle East and North Africa.
And Tunisia was one of the countries that saw a lot of change.
It was. So when Ben Ali was forced out, there was this big push to recover those stolen assets.
And it didn't work.
Well, some assets were frozen, but a lot of the money, it just vanished. It's likely that it was hidden away in these complex financial structures, protected by allies in other countries.
So even with all the best intentions, all the resources...
Sometimes it's just not enough. These cases are incredibly complex.
What were some of the obstacles in the Ben Ali case?
Well, one of the biggest is just the lack of transparency in the global financial system. It's so easy to move money across borders, hide it in these secrecy havens. It makes it incredibly difficult to track.
So we need to reform the system.
We do. More transparency, more accountability, that's essential.
And I imagine it also depends on countries being willing to cooperate, right?
Absolutely. And sometimes that cooperation is just not there, maybe because of political considerations, diplomatic sensitivities, even economic interests.
So it's not just a legal battle, it's also a political battle.
It is. And it requires a long-term perspective, a commitment to building strong institutions, a belief that accountability is possible.
It's a lot.
It is. But we have to keep pushing. Every successful case, it shows that it can be done. It gives us hope.
So these two cases, Abacha and Ben Ali, what can we learn from them? What are the key takeaways?
I think the biggest takeaway is that this is a global issue. It requires a global response. We need better legal frameworks. We need more cooperation between countries.
And we need to keep fighting, right? Even when it seems impossible.
Exactly. We can't let corruption win. We have to keep pushing for transparency, for accountability, for justice.
It's inspiring to see the work that's being done. So what's next? What are the next steps in this fight, particularly when it comes to the Assad regime?
Well, I think we need to focus on building the capacity of those investigative bodies, strengthening legal frameworks, and promoting international cooperation.
Makes sense. What about technology? It seems like it could play a role in all of this.
Oh, absolutely. Technology is changing the game when it comes to asset tracing and recovery. We're seeing more sophisticated data analytics tools, artificial intelligence, machine learning.
So we're using algorithms to hunt down stolen money now.
In a way, yes. They help connect the dots, analyze huge amounts of data, identify suspicious transactions.
So it's not just about human intelligence anymore. We're using computers to outsmart these criminals.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as these technologies keep developing, they're becoming even more powerful tools in our fight against corruption and financial crime.
It's incredible, really. But is it enough? I mean, the Assad regime, they've been in power for so long, they have a lot of resources, and they've been pretty good at evading accountability.
It's a valid question. It's a daunting task, for sure. But I think there's reason for hope.
Really?
I think so. The world is changing. There's more awareness about corruption now, about illicit financial flows, and there's a growing movement to do something about it.
So the tide is turning.
I believe it is. The tools are getting better, international cooperation is increasing, and there's more political will to hold people accountable.
That's encouraging.
It's a long process. One of the big challenges moving forward is the lack of uniform laws. Different countries have different rules, different procedures. It makes it hard to work across borders.
So we need a more unified system.
We do. We need clear international standards for asset recovery, and we need countries to commit to cooperating with each other.
So it's a big job.
It is, but it's a job worth doing. The stakes are high.
It's about justice.
It is. It's about making sure that those who steal from their own people are held responsible for their actions.
I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've looked at the challenges of recovering assets, the successes and failures of the past, and we've talked about the importance of never giving up, of working together. It's a complex story and it can be disheartening, but there are people out there who are fighting for justice.
Every day.
And they're making a difference. But I think we need to look at some more specific cases.
Yes, case studies can be very illuminating.
So in the next part of our deep dive, we'll do just that. We've spent a lot of time digging into the Assad's fortune, the ways they hide it, and the efforts to, well, bring it back. I think now would be good to look at some real-world examples.
Yeah, good idea. Looking at specific cases, it can really help, see what works, what doesn't.
Right. And I think one of the most well-known cases is the one with Sani Abacha.
The Nigerian dictator.
Right. We touched on it briefly before.
Yeah, it's a case that really shows just how complex this whole thing can be. Asset recovery, I mean.
Can you remind us, what happened exactly and why this case is so important?
Okay, so Sani Abacha, he was in power for 5 years, from 93 to 98.
Okay.
And during that time, he and his people, they stole billions of dollars from the Nigerian people.
It's hard to even imagine that much money.
It's a lot. And they were hiding it everywhere. Offshore accounts, investments, you name it. It was a huge scheme.
Mm-hmm.
And it meant that, the Nigerian people were deprived of so much.
Resources, I imagine.
Everything. Money for schools, healthcare infrastructure. It was a huge loss.
So how did they manage to recover the money? It sounds almost impossible.
It wasn't easy, that's for sure. It took a lot of hard work, years of investigation, legal battles. But the Nigerian authorities, they were determined.
To get that money back.
Absolutely. And they had help, too, from countries like Switzerland, the UK, the US.
Working together.
Exactly. And they were able to track the money, freeze the assets, and then build this legal case to get it all back.
It's amazing that they were able to do that, to track all that money across the world.
It was a huge undertaking. But it shows that it can be done. It can be done with the right approach.
So what was it, the right approach? What are the key things that made them successful?
Well, I think the biggest thing was the commitment. The Nigerian government, they were committed to getting that money back for the people.
So having a government that's willing to fight for this is important.
It's crucial, absolutely crucial. Without that, it's very hard to make any progress.
That makes sense.
And of course, the international support was essential too. Those partnerships, that willingness to share information, to cooperate.
It's that global effort again.
Right. We can't solve these problems in isolation. It takes a network, a global network of people working together.
So what are the lessons we can learn from the Abacha case, especially when it comes to the Assads?
Well, for one, persistence is key. We can't give up.
Yeah.
These cases, they can take a really long time.
We said years, even decades.
Exactly. And there will be obstacles, roadblocks, setbacks. But you have to keep going.
Don't lose sight of the goal.
Right. And also, flexibility. Be creative. You need to be adaptable.
Not be afraid to try new things.
Exactly. And again, building those partnerships. Because these are global problems, we need global solutions. The Abacha case, it shows that when we work together, when we're committed, when we don't give up, well, it is possible to achieve justice.
That's a good point. It's hopeful, too. But it also makes me wonder, Have there been cases where it just, hasn't worked out? Where they tried to recover assets and, I don't know, just couldn't?
Yeah, there have. Sadly, not all asset recovery efforts are successful. One example is, well, we talked about him earlier, Zine El Abidine Ben Ali.
The Tunisian president.
Right. He and his family, they were pretty corrupt.
Uh,
And when they were forced out during the Arab Spring,
During all the protests.
yes, exactly, there was a big effort to recover their assets.
And it failed.
Not entirely. Some assets were frozen, but a lot of it just disappeared.
How is that even possible?
It's complicated. A lot of it comes down to the global financial system. It's designed in a way that makes it very easy to hide money, especially if you're powerful, if you have connections.
So even with the best intentions, even when everyone's trying to do the right thing,
Sometimes the system just works against you.
to frustrate.
It is. It's incredibly frustrating. But it also highlights the need for change. We need a system that's more transparent, more accountable.
So it's not just about going after the bad guys, it's about fixing the system itself.
Exactly. We need to make it harder for people to hide money, to get away with corruption. And that requires a global effort. It requires cooperation. It requires commitment.
It's a lot.
It is.
Yeah.
But it's worth fighting for. Because this is about justice. It's about fairness. It's about making sure that those who have been wronged, those who have been stolen from, well, that they get some measure of justice.
Well said. These cases, the Abacha case, the Ben Ali case, they show us that this is a long fight, complex fight. But it's a fight we can't afford to lose. And every time we recover stolen assets, every time we hold someone accountable, it's a victory. It's a step in the right direction. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Assad family fortune, I think it's important to remember that there are people out there fighting for justice, fighting to recover what's been stolen, fighting to hold the powerful accountable. And that's a fight worth supporting. Thanks for joining us on this journey.